Hello? Hello? I'm on now. All right. Good evening. Welcome, Wednesday night crowd. How y'all doing? Good. Glad to have you. Glad to have you here this evening. Scott, I kind of had a last minute, had to work, and just really didn't have time to put anybody on the spot to get up here and partner up with me. I will, though. Go ahead. If I have to handpick you, I'll handpick you. But on the 6th, I'll need a partner on the 6th of May. Scott won't be here. And then on the 20th of May. That's sure enough. I know that. I was planned in advance. So I'll be needing somebody. You can volunteer or I can pick you for it to come up here and help and give you feedback on it, on those lessons. I've got kind of the, Scott gave me how he wants the lessons to go from here on out, so we'll still be in Galatians before then. So anyway, just kind of a preview. We're in Galatians. If you weren't here last week, we started with the introduction, just kind of a preview, real quick overview of chapter 1 with Paul. And forgive me as we go through this lesson when we get into chapter 2 and we'll talk about Paul. When I read, and I don't know if I may be the only person like this, but when I read Paul stuff, and between what Paul writes and where he is, and what's written, what Luke writes in Acts, and the timelines and all that kind of stuff, it's kind of like scrambled eggs to me. It really is. You too. I get Linda. You just join me on that. But it's like, did this happen before or after that, or when did that happen? And that's one of the things that this has really kind of forced me to do is try to find out. Okay, when did this happen? Where did this happen? How did this happen? And there's so much because Paul was so engaged. Paul wrote the backbone of the New Testament. 13 of the epistles are from him. So there's just so much there, and it's so interesting. I think when you try to look at, okay, when does this Galatian stuff happen compared to what we read about in Acts and all? I try to pull some of that out a little bit here, but we get into this big defense of Paul in chapter 1. He defends the gospel a little bit, and some points that were made last week was Paul defends himself a lot by saying, hey, nobody taught him what he's teaching, and nobody taught him what he's teaching. It was given to him by Jesus in Damascus in one of those moments. And in addition to that, a real great point that Paul brings out, but Terry brought out, was that he had it made as a Jew. He had it made. I mean, he had there was no motivation that he would have to teach the gospel had it not been revealed to him like that. He's living the good life as a Pharisee of Pharisees out there. So, and specifically when he gets into a little bit of defending the gospel in chapter 1 with this warning about these Judaizers, and we'll probably get into this a little bit more as we get into chapter 2, and it's specifically a lot about circumcision, and he spreads that and broadens that to include the old law throughout his writings, but circumcision is really a big deal, and we'll find that out later in this as we go into chapter 2. But one of the things that as I was looking back at some of the other stuff that Paul did, when Jesus gives him his wake-up call in Acts, what is he? We kind of jumped last week. We said, well, he went for 3 years in Arabia, which he did do. But as soon as he came to from all that and was baptized, he started preaching the gospel. What did he preach? What was it? What did he preach? Initially, what he preached was this. He would go around into the synagogues in Damascus, and he would preach, according to Acts, Jesus is the Son of God. That was his message. Not much more is given to us than that. Jesus, before he goes off to Arabia, Jesus is the Son. I just thought, well, here's this wise man that knows all this Old Testament. We get all this stuff from him, all this information, all of the backbone of the New Testament from him. He started out preaching the gospel. It was Jesus is the Son of God, walking into the Gospels. And it reminds me a little bit, I talk about Jonah a lot, but it reminds me of the message Jonah had. Jonah had 8 words, 5 in Hebrew, and that was his message. That was his entire gospel. It's not, the gospel is not something that's really difficult to preach or teach, So now we're going to talk a little bit more on that today, but I just wanted to bring that out to you. It didn't start out, because when you read Paul, he can get pretty profound. It really can. It can get difficult to understand. It starts out, sometimes they'll start out fun to read, and then all of a sudden, what did I just read? What did I just say? But he started out simple. Started out real simple. And as time went on, his teaching seems to get more and more complex and more detailed. And so I just thought that was an interesting point. He goes to Arabia. He ends up going back to Damascus. 3 years after the event occurs on the road to Damascus, he goes to Jerusalem. And I don't think we talked enough about this. There were disciples there in Jerusalem that were afraid of him because of what he had been before then, what he had done before then. They were afraid. They were discipled there. They were afraid of him. But he meets with Peter and James. And you will notice Paul calls Peter Cephas. So he calls him by his Aramaic name. If you ever wondered what Bo Cephas meant, now you know. Bo Peter. All right? But he does reference to him that. And another thing that I really thought about when I think about Paul, and how, because Paul is from the outside coming in, really. We've got the apostles. The apostles are going out and they're making disciples out there to spread the gospel in Israel. Kind of setting the stage here. But an event that popped out and just came up to my mind was y'all remember an event that happened in Luke chapter 9 when we have one of these scenes where the disciples are arguing, or the apostles are with Jesus, and they're arguing, who's the greatest? Who's the greatest? Who's the greatest? Ain't the first time they've done it. They've done it quite a bit. But John speaks up, and John says, we saw a guy driving out demons in your name, and he wasn't with us. And what does Jesus tell them? Jesus tells them, if they're not against you, they're with you. And I just wonder in the back of his mind, if this is just wait until you meet Paul. Just wait until you meet this guy. Have I got a surprise for you coming down the road? But wasn't that great that Jesus got that point across to them before these things? And when you see Paul going to Peter, especially, and to John, and you wonder if that's going through their mind. That's just speculation on my part and all. But I thought that was just, a place I wanted to go there. But in chapter 2, we get this continuation of Paul's, the defense of not so much the gospel, but it's really more about defending Paul for the most part here and how he is. And he's going to get more in defending the gospel, I think, in chapter 3 as we go through Galatians. He's teaching it. He's teaching it without circumcision, but also without the law. And he's teaching that he's teaching this gospel of faith. So what are the main points when you read this chapter? What are the main points in this chapter? Do you think? Yeah. What else does anybody pick up from that?
I mean, really, overall, it's an argument against still keeping the old law. I mean, it revolves around circumcision, but we end up, by the end of the chapter, really breaking down that entire Mosaic law and saying that's not the point anymore.
Right.
That's not going to save you. And it's this idea that law was, while it was temporary, it was not adequate for salvation. And so all these acts that we're still trying to do and enforce upon new converts, you're missing the whole point.
Yeah. And it's this going back to Jerusalem. He's going back to Jerusalem for a second time. And all. And then there's also, you can't, when you read chapter 2, this is the chapter where, you know, he dresses down Cephas, Peter, for what Peter's doing too. That's a big part of this chapter. It's important. I think we talk about when we get to that point in the chapter, we talk about that a little bit. It's there. So how long has it been? I think I just mentioned that. How long has it been? 14. So Paul, 3 years. Now he's been out there for 14 years. You know, now he's writing epistles. Right? I think we think Thessalonians is what he first wrote. So he's gone from hey, Jesus is the Son of God. What else do I need to? What else do we need to talk about? To now, boy, you can fill your cup with it. Who's with him? Barnabas. And Barnabas leaves with him after his 3-year visit. Is that right? And then who else is with him? Titus, the Greek guy. Right? Why did he go? Why did he, after 14 years, why would he want to go back to Jerusalem? Why does he need to go back? What?
God told him. God told him to.
We get a revelation and all. Oh, but what is he, after that sentence, after that verse, this bothers me a little bit. He gets this revelation communicated to him. But what does he say just after that? It's not just a revelation, but he also states he's wanting to go down there. What? For what other reason? Yeah. He go ahead. No, go ahead. No, you go. You need a microphone? I know microphone guys are laying out on us.
That he has received is directly from Jesus, so he is very confident in the gospel that he's been preaching. I don't know if you're referring to the fact when he says I wanted to go and submit the gospel that I preached to them to show that I haven't been running in vain.
Yeah.
And I think the fact that he's more interested in finding out what they're preaching. He knows what he's preaching is the gospel, is the truth. And he thinks that if he finds out that those who are of reputation, the apostles, are teaching something different, then that's going to be a detriment to the true gospel that he has been preaching.
Yeah, exactly. We have this verse in there. It says he had a revelation, but he's also wanting to make sure that he's not, he says, running in vain. That he's not doing what he's doing either, out of just for no reason whatsoever, or, you could also interpret that to mean for his own vanity, possibly. Go ahead, John.
I think when you put that with this confrontation with Peter, that Paul knew what he was doing was right. Like Chris said, his point, he needed to make sure what everybody else teaching was right. They weren't contradicting him. And we see the need for that because we see Peter kind of going off track. And that's why they had the confrontation. So yeah, there was a need for him to go and talk about his work and talk about what God had done, because there were still those, even among the believers, who were not sticking with that faith.
Yeah, I read some commentaries on this. Here is Paul in an effort to maybe promote some unity in the church. Do we do that? I'm going to give you a good example of a time I remember I know that it's been done. Of course, this has more to do maybe with leadership, but I can remember in Munford, Alabama, we went to the Munford Church of Christ there, and we had some brothers and sisters that were sudden. I was a little old church out in the middle of nowhere, and we had some brothers and sisters coming from another church, filling the pews in our church, and I remember it was glaringly obvious. Hey, where are you from? Well, but it was a lot, and there was an issue or something that was going on there. And I remember our two elders, they took it about themselves to go and visit, with that congregation. Say, hey, what's going on here? And I can remember that because I really respected what they did. They could have just buried their head and pretended like nothing happened, because there was obviously a problem, that was happening there, whether it was the people or leadership with it. But I just remember how impressed I was with that they were doing that. But as a whole, we don't have a convention every year, do we? That's something churches of Christ don't do. My grandmother warned me about that kind of stuff. Yeah, but here we have church leadership of congregations meeting together to talk about things. How should we handle issues today? Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. Do y'all ever go out to other congregations and say, "Hey, y'all are doing something wrong," or "Hey, what are y'all doing here? Y'all doing something right?" Or help us. How do you do this? How do you do VBS? How do you go to Honduras?
I don't know that we have. But if there is an issue going on in a congregation, you do want to know about that.
Yeah.
Because especially these days, it's easy, like you said, for someone just to go somewhere else. And as shepherds, you need to know who's coming into your flock and what sort of, if they're bringing baggage with them, for lack of a better term, you need to know that.
Yeah.
Paul is convinced of the fact that the law has been put to death, right? Christ has put the law to death. And he talks about that towards the end of the chapter, about how the law, he and how he died to the law, right? He says in verse 19, I, through the law, died to the law that I might live to God. And I think he's really concerned that the law is kind of like an albatross. It's a noose around your neck. It's going to kill you because you can't live up to it, right? And he knows that. He's experienced that, and it's so important for us. When we talk to people about the good news of the gospel, it's freeing. It gets us away from the curse of death. Right, the curse of sin. And he's really convinced that if you go back to the law, you're going back to the curse of death. You're going back to the curse of, hey, I can't live up to this. And if you can't live up to it, why would you want to put that on anybody else? Why would you want to put that circumcision, put that curse on your fellow man that you couldn't live up to, and I couldn't live up to, and nobody could live up to it but Christ, and he freed us from it. Why do you want to go back to the grave, that curse of death? So it's really important, and I think that's one of the main reasons he goes. Obviously, he goes because he's told to go, but you know, it's vitally important that you don't put that curse of the old law on people, because it's unattainable, right? Christ died to get us away from that. He died to free us from it.
It makes you wonder if that revelation he had was more about God telling Paul, hey, you need to go down and fix this. There's some issues that maybe I need you to handle, possibly. Who knows? Dave, you got something?
So you were talking about those scrambled eggs when we first got started, and this event in Galatians, I think it's the same time when he visited with Barnabas in Acts 15. Is that right?
I don't know.
I mean,
it looks like it is.
I mean, he didn't go to Jerusalem that many times, and you're like, well, I guess that's the same one. And if he said he went by revelation here, and then back in Acts it said that, you know, it was determined or decided that he and Barnabas should go. Probably Holy Spirit revealed it. So,
because he and Barnabas have a breakup here before too long, right?
yeah,
So,
I guess so. That scrambled egg stuff, you know, hits me pretty hard too. But
Yeah.
I think it's the same one.
I think it is.
And if it is, that's the whole point of why they journeyed there, is to get that issue settled about circumcision.
Yeah.
And which, you know, when you read the details of Paul here in Galatians, it seems like he said, basically, we all agreed, and they asked me to remember the poor. But he didn't really get into, we talked about circumcision, and we had these 4 things that Gentiles were going to abstain from. So it's a little bit like, I don't know for sure, but I think it's the same one.
Yep.
But that's the same topic.
It appears to be, and Peter quotes, Peter says exactly what you said, which was, you know, hey, don't put a yoke on us that we can't, that we couldn't handle. Why are you doing that to the Gentiles? You know, so anyway.
Eric, I mean, this is obviously a contentious topic. I mean, we see that all throughout the New Testament. But his approach to it, every time we see it discussed, it's not what I believe or what I think or my opinion. It always goes back to, this is what God has shown, this is what God has said. And I think through all this, the focus is on what God wants, not what Paul wants, not what Peter wants. And part of this, I think maybe just making sure everybody in the church is preaching the gospel, as simple as much as it is, and that it's God's gospel, the gospel of Jesus, not Paul's gospel, not Peter's gospel. We need to be preaching the same thing.
Yeah, and I want to talk about this a little bit later, but we can go ahead now, because the contentious subject specifically is circumcision. I mean, honestly, you probably could have picked a better way to get me to follow you, but we have enough trouble getting people into baptistry. But this circumcision issue is huge if you're a Jew. You know? And if you just, I mean, and you think there's a lot written about circumcision in the Old Testament. When you look at all the discussion about circumcision in the New Testament, it's insane. A lot of it's Paul. But, you know, if you, who was the first one to get circumcised? Abraham. You know, who was the first one that almost got killed because his son didn't get circumcised? Moses. You know, we just read about that. It's obviously very important. That's out there. It is you cannot. There's specific rules on it. It's done after, if you're Jewish, it's done after you're born on the 8th day. Luke says John the Baptizer was circumcised. Oh, so now we're going to take it. Now they can take it from. Oh, let's talk about the old guys here. Let's talk. I can see these Judaizers saying this. John the Baptist was circumcised. Jesus, the Son of God, according to Luke, was circumcised, or at least it appears that he was circumcised. So why wouldn't They want to push that. As a man, you were born Jewish by the tribe that you came out of, but you're not going to step foot in that temple, and you're not going to be sanctioned for anything. You do not count unless you're circumcised. Period. And that's what they grew up with, all their lives. And now you've got this guy trying to tell these Gentiles you don't have to do it. And you've got this guy telling these Jews you don't, have to do it. And all. But what happens when he gets there? When Paul gets there? What'd they try to do? We got a Greek guy here, huh? Oh, yeah, I know, it's scrambled eggs. It is. It's getting crazy, isn't it? But go ahead. Okay, so he's there. He shows up. They're having a meeting. They've arranged this somehow. They want to get Titus. They want to get Titus. And what happens? So riddle me this. So why does Paul circumcise Timothy? So what? I said the same thing. I was like, no, I said, okay, well, I didn't mean that ugly. Yeah. What's good enough?
It was just
he didn't
clear
like Timothy.
that Gentiles were not to travel to Jerusalem from China or the United States to observe a feast 3 times a year. God's getting ready to shut that down. And circumcision is the doorway into the Mosaic law pretty much. And it wasn't going to stop with circumcision. In Acts 15, they said they must be circumcised and keep the law of Moses to be saved. Mm-hmm. That was the whole controversy. And we can't keep the law of Moses. They're not keeping it either. Nobody's sacrificing animals. They're not all going to Jerusalem 3 times a year. They've got their own version of the law, and they got their own version of the Passover nowadays too, but it's not the same as the original one. Nobody's roasting a lamb over the fire with its entrails. So it's just the law had to go away.
Yeah.
It was going global.
Yeah.
And circumcision was of the heart. And the New Testament made that clear. And the Old Testament talked about it a little bit. But it was just everything got changed.
Yeah. John?
Just going to say, it seemed that doing that allowed Timothy access to help Paul in his teaching. Not that it was required, but it did open doors of opportunity for him by doing that, to allow him into the synagogue, to allow him into places where an uncircumcised Gentile Greek would not be allowed to go.
Yeah.
So it was a tool to help further the gospel, though it wasn't required for his salvation.
Right.
I think is how I would look at that.
So Timothy and Paul would. What was the first thing Paul did whenever he went into a city? He'd go to synagogue, wouldn't he?
And Timothy could not go with him.
Yeah.
If he was uncircumcised.
Right. And I guess it's the honor system.
Well,
but
it's the and I've always questioned why circumcision. Why is that the thing that everybody is so focused on? But it was the one thing that you could confirm. It was a physical sign that couldn't be faked. It couldn't be a part-time where all the feast days and the food restrictions. Somebody, if they wanted to, they could fake that.
Right.
You can't fake circumcision.
No.
So it was the one thing that they could absolutely point to and say, yes, this person has followed the law.
Right. So I think that it was kind of a political move, really. It was like, Timothy, you're going to be going into places that have synagogues, and you need to go in there and preach the gospel to them as well, and you can't step foot in there unless you're circumcised. And I think that's the answer to the question. It was a strategic move by Paul to make sure that he wouldn't run into trouble with that. Did he have to have one? No, he didn't have to have one. But for that to happen and for not Timothy to die like the first time he tried to do it, he had to make I don't want to say a concession there, but he had to make a strategic move, a political move, if you will, and to get that gun done. Titus, on the other hand, he's in Greece and he's not having to do anything with synagogues. It seems he's in Crete. I don't know if there's not synagogues in Crete at this time, but his work seems to be outside of any kind of opportunity with synagogues or dealing much with Jews, is where he is. But
I don't think because him being a Gentile, he wouldn't have been accepted to the Jews and the synagogues anyway. You know, the one thing about Timothy is because his mother was Jewish, he was Jewish.
he was Jewish. Yeah, they would consider him Jewish, but he had to get circumcised. Yeah. So.
Yeah, Eric, I think Brandon is really correct on that. That's kind of, because I looked at the difference between the Timothy and Titus situations, to try to understand why one was done one way and the other is exactly that point. Because Timothy was Jew, or at least half Jew, and he was going with Paul on some missionary journeys, or with other people on missionary journeys, who would go to the synagogue and didn't want to offend them, wanted to be part of them, wanted to be able to reach out to them and explain Jesus as a Messiah using the Old Testament. Whereas Titus was clearly a Gentile, and Paul was trying to make the point, absolutely circumcision not required for salvation through Jesus Christ. And so kind of two different points, two different approaches.
It also goes to the, where Paul says, to the Greeks I became as a Greek.
I was going to say that.
Were you? Okay.
Say it, John.
Yeah, 1 Corinthians
You
9,
say it,
Timothy.
Let John
picture.
talk.
It paints, it falls under that, what Brandon was saying about how Paul's, I will change however I need to change for whoever's listening to believe and become a follower of Christ. If I got to be weak to the weak, I'll be weak. If I got to fall under the law for the people that are under the law, that's what I'm going to do to get them to listen. If the listener's not under the law, then I'm not going to be under the law. I just want them to listen. I'm going to change my strategy to meet that person on their home field to get them to heaven.
Yeah, and Paul makes some points too about eating meat sacrificed to idols and some other things, to where, he's not going to do that so he doesn't offend people, although he knows there's nothing wrong with it. So.
And that's a great attitude for us to have, for us to have that mindset with people. We're going out to try to teach the gospel to people. We may have to do things, and I'm not saying that we do things against God's will, okay? But we can meet people where they're at to try to get them to the gospel, and there's nothing wrong with trying to meet somebody where they're at, where you can talk to them about Jesus. I mean, that's a pattern that we see in the New Testament.
Yep. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I think ultimately that's our answer from an earlier question when the class started about, talking with other faiths and, hey, what are y'all doing wrong here? What are y'all doing right here? It's really just talking with them in a way to try to see the truth together.
Yeah, I mean, if you're gonna go and talk to somebody, let's say you go talk to somebody that's Catholic. There's a lot of congruence that we have. We both believe in baptism. That's really important. I'm not going to go off and say, hey, the Pope is a lie. That's stupid. That doesn't do anything. Go to the points of congruence rather than the points of contention. And I think that's kind of what we're learning here of, hey, this stuff about circumcision, it was a stumbling block and it was wrong. Okay, so it had to be handled. But in other ways, you need to go to where you can facilitate teaching somebody about Christ.
Paul also makes an interesting comment, that, Abraham was considered righteous before his circumcision. So, Paul uses that too in some of his in his discourse with these Judaizers. Yes, sir.
His whole point is justification by faith and not circumcision. I think his whole point is the fact that what makes it wrong is that they were preaching a Jesus plus gospel, and they were trying to bring the law of Moses into bondage. And if we relate it to Acts 15, Paul says some of the sect of the Pharisees who believed stood up and were saying that it was necessary to direct them to be circumcised and obey the law of Moses. And these Pharisees who had believed, who are described that way in Acts 15, Paul, if it's the same people, Paul calls them false brethren. And I don't know if that's the same, if he's directing that toward the same people, or maybe because he says they, in Galatians 2 here, he says they were secretly brought in. So I don't know if they were just other Pharisees who influenced the believing Pharisees, but if they're the same people, that's a pretty profound thing to think about. If you're a believer, but you are believing in or teaching and trying to bring somebody into bondage, a version of the gospel that is Jesus plus this, then Paul calls that, if he's talking about these same people, he calls them false brethren.
Yeah.
And I think that's pretty powerful for us to consider on,
Here's another strong statement. When in his letter to Titus, you're familiar with it, he's talking about leadership in the church, and he warns them, for there are many rebellious people, mere talkers and deceivers, especially those of the circumcision group. They must be silenced because they are ruining whole households by teaching things they ought not teach, and that for the sake of dishonest gain. And then he goes on to say, even one of their prophets has said, Cretans, which he's on Crete, Cretans are always liars, evils, brutes, and lazy gluttons. Paul had a little fire in his belly about this subject, about that. And you're right, he'd call it out. He'd call them out out there. So what prompted them to extend fellowship to Paul and Barnabas? They concurred, didn't they? They agreed with him. They said, "Yeah, you're teaching what you ought to teach." So when Peter comes to Antioch, what was it? What happened? Why does he front Peter? Why does he find it necessary to withstand him to his face? What was happening here? How?
Trying to act like a Jew around Jewish folks and trying to act like a Gentile around the Gentiles.
How was it obvious, though, John? Yeah. How though? What I mean? How?
I mean, he was trying to play both sides of the fence. That he would, when it was just the Gentiles, oh yeah, we're good. I'll commune with you. I'll eat with you. And then the Jews show up, those who still believed in circumcision, and he kind of distanced himself from that and seemingly takes a different stance and agrees with them, maybe not verbally, but his actions show that he supports their side of the argument that circumcision is still required. So he's being double-faced in this. Yeah.
And Paul even goes on to say he does this out of fear.
He separates himself from the Gentiles. Basically, he's trying to keep the old law where if you're a Gentile and I'm a Jew, I can't be around you.
Yeah. And Paul says, how is it you're trying to convince people to be like Gentiles, and here you are acting like a Jew?
And even worse, in his position of authority, that led others to follow him in that. So
Right.
It wasn't just him.
It was influence.
It was his influence leading others astray, doing that as well.
And I think for us, a big lesson here is, I learned this playing football. When you were a senior on the football team, People looked up to you whether you liked it or not, or whether you wanted to or not, whether it was fair or not, and all. The same thing's true, I think, being somebody that's in Christ, somebody that goes out and teaches the gospel to people, somebody that tries to, do good things, to take care of the poor, feed people, all that stuff. People look up to you if you're in Christ, whether you want them to or not, and your actions can compel them to do things they ought not do or ought not be out there. And whether what they mean by fear was that, he just dreaded them or revered them or whatever the case may be, I don't know, but it influenced other people, and it was obvious to Paul that was the case, and he fronted Peter on that issue, and so I don't know any more comments about that.
I think a deeper issue there that's maybe not stated is that it seems that he was afraid to confront that false teaching. It's not that he was just afraid of them and of that image, but he had not stood up to correct them at all, as far as we know to this point.
Yeah.
And it reads like something that had been going on for a while, maybe not, but it was that fear of confrontation, that fear of standing up for what's right, not just fear of the people. Yeah. And we can't be like that. We've got to stand on what's right.
John?
Yeah, for me it sounds like that Peter lived a long life as a Jew and has recently changed through Christ that now he can live like a Gentile. He had the vision in Acts about being able to eat things that he's never been able to eat, and now he's living like a Gentile.
Yeah.
And not just not standing up to this hypocrisy, but to me it sounds like he's leading it, because he is a leader in this church in Jerusalem. To me, he is part of the leadership of telling the Gentiles that you got to do Jewish stuff. Yeah. Even though my Jew, I can do Gentile stuff now. Just complete hypocrisy.
Yeah.
14 years later, too.
Right. 14 years later after this. And Peter, as you said, he's seen that, he's had that vision on the food, and he's given that because he's got to go preach the gospel. Is it Cornelius? He's got to go preach the gospel to Cornelius, and God's telling him, nothing's unclean. You go to it. He's a Gentile, and it's talked about in the Bible. Peter goes to the Jews and Paul goes to the Gentiles. But in truth, they're teaching to both. Peter teaches Gentiles and Jews, more so on the Jew side. And Paul definitely, we know, he goes into synagogues everywhere he goes, so he's preaching to Jews and Gentiles. But primarily, he sets up and establishes all these congregations, across Asia and Rome and all kinds of stuff. John?
I would just say, as we go through all this, there's one word we talked about. It keeps coming up over and over, and that's gospel. And when we look at, what did Paul confront Peter with? The truth of the gospel. That was his answer for all of these arguments.
Yeah.
He didn't go back to the old law. He didn't go back to anything else. It's all comes back to the gospel of Jesus Christ. That was the foundation and the core of everything. And beyond that, all these old laws, all these old traditions, all that had been crucified. None of that mattered. It's crucifixion, not circumcision. It's all about that gospel now. Yeah. And when you can focus on it that way, all these other problems are solved.
Yeah. Real quick, verse 16. What's the main argument there? It kind of crescendos all this into this chapter 6, verse 16.
We can't live up to the law.
Right.
We can't get fixed by the law.
Your faith in Jesus Christ.
The only way we can get rid of it.
Yeah. And
The works are dead.
Yeah.
The works don't get us anywhere.
Yeah.
And ultimately, they should be seeing at this point in time that the works that are being done in the temple are really useless. If they believe in Jesus, okay, what's going on in the temple is of no effect. Right?
Right.
It's of absolutely no effect. So
And we know that your works will certainly demonstrate your faith. Jesus will tell at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, for those of you who hear what I have to say and doeth them, you're like a man that builds his house on a rock. So we know that works are important, but it's the faith. There's not enough work you could do to earn it. And one of the points that Paul will bring out is to assume that you could work your way into salvation by following the law, or work your way into salvation is an implication that Christ is not enough, that Christ's death on the cross was insufficient for your salvation. And he wants to make sure that everybody understands that's not the case. So anyway, appreciate the participation. We had a real good participation. We'll be in chapter 3 next week, and we'll start more defense on the gospel itself. Paul's kind of finishes his chapter 2, starts rolling into the defense of the gospel. Thank you.